All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Henry. I'm the president of the Economics Club at Saratoga High School. And I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today, this Friday evening, for our speaker conference, COVID-19 and the economy. We really do have a fantastic lineup of speakers who will be talking about some awesome topics and answering your guys' questions. As for the format of our speaker series, we'll first have a speaker go ahead and give their presentation. If there's any remaining time after their presentation, we'll go into Q&A. Now, before we dive right into the conference, we do have a few norms and expectations in order to make sure that this event goes as smoothly as possible. First, and most importantly, if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Zoom private message feature to message them to Apurva Chakravarti, our VP of Finance. Apurva will be asking the questions on your behalf. This means that you should not be asking the questions to the speakers themselves. Please note that you don't need to wait to send your questions to Apurva during the Q&A session after the presentation. If you think of a question during the presentation, you can go ahead and send it to Apurva without waiting for the presentation to be over. Second, in order to show respect towards our speakers, we would prefer if you could turn on your cameras if possible. Third, as you might have gotten the message, this event will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube in order to reach a wider audience. By participating in this event, you're agreeing to be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. Lastly, if you must leave the event, please leave only during the intermission at around 5:30 or at the end of the event in order to show respect for our speakers.
Hi everyone, my name is Apurva Chakravarti and I'm currently the Vice President of Finance at Saratoga High's Economics Club. Our club was founded in 2018 by our current president, Henry Wang, with the goal of introducing students to economics through fun and interactive events. We are also a founding chapter of the Youth Economics Initiative, YEI, an international organization that aims to improve economic literacy and unite economics clubs all around the globe. Every year, we participate in events like the National Economics Challenge, the KWHS Investment Competition, and the YEI Econ Bowl. Now, let's introduce all the officers of the Saratoga High Economics Club.
Hi, my name's Henry, and I'm the president of the Economics Club.
Hey, I'm Andy Chen. I'm currently a sophomore, and I'm one of two executive vice presidents of the club.
Hi, I'm Cheryl. I'm also a sophomore, and I'm the other executive vice president.
Hi again, I'm Apurva. I'm the Vice President of Finance. I'm also a sophomore, and I'm the person that you should send your questions to for the Q&A sessions.
Hi everyone, my name is Marcus. I'm the Vice President of Operations, and I'm also a sophomore at Saratoga High.
Hey everyone, my name is Niloy Mishra. I'm the Vice President of Outreach, and I'm a freshman at Saratoga High.
All right, so now we'll be moving on to our speaker introductions. Our first two speakers are Janice Albright and Roy Bahat. Miss Albright is the owner of Big Basin Burger Bar, which is a restaurant in downtown Saratoga. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but she did leave us with a journal on the impact COVID-19 had on her business, which we'll present. And Mr. Bahat is currently the head of Bloomberg Beta, a venture capital firm specializing in AI and machine learning.
Our next speaker will be Professor Ajay Shenoy. Professor Shenoy is an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, and he was the founder of the Income Dynamics Lab. After that, we'll be having a short intermission. And when we come back, we'll hear from Associate Professor Scott Baker. Professor Baker currently teaches at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, and he's a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Mark Brady is a professor at San Jose State University in the College of Social Sciences, and George Bulman is the assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, and he's also the associate editor of the Public Finance Review. Professor Ashoka Modi is a Charles M. Marie Robinson visiting professor in the International Economics Policy at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. We had originally planned to have him speak, but unfortunately he is sick, so he won't be able to speak today.
All right, everyone. Before we start with our wonderful speakers, we'd like to have a quick game of Kahoot to get everyone excited. So Marcus should start screen sharing now, and you'll all get the game pin.
So it's best if you all join on your phones or go to kahoot.it and put in the game pin so you can play along. Hey guys, just a reminder that we would like everybody to keep their cameras on, just so we can see everybody.
Congrats to everyone on our leaderboard.
Nice job, Creative Seal.
right, so like remember, stagflation is when there's unemployment and inflation. All right, creative seal, nice job.
Nimble piranha, good job. Good job, Blue Wombat.
All right, so we actually are running a little bit low on time. So I think 2 more questions and we'll end the Kahoot with our first speaker.
Last question. Thank you everyone for playing. We'll stop the Kahoot now, so congrats to Blue Wombat for winning.
Yay. Okay, so our first speaker is Janice Albright. Janice Albright is the owner of Big Basin Burger Bar, a successful burger restaurant in downtown Saratoga that first opened in 2015. Big Basin Burger Bar won Best of Los Gatos Saratoga Look 2017 awards and received awards of excellence by the Saratoga City Council. Again, she couldn't be here today, but she left us with a journal on how COVID-19 impacted her business. As she is not actually here, we won't be able to do Q&A for Ms. Albright. She thanks us for the opportunity to share her experience on how COVID-19 impacts local business and economies like hers. Saturday, March 14th. I was worried about the immediate impact on the food industry since the COVID-19 outbreak and the cases confirmed in the Bay Area. My worries were confirmed as sales dropped significantly on Saturday, the busiest day of the week. Sunday, March 15th. Our sales dropped to 30% of a normal Sunday. We heard that a shelter-in-place order would likely begin at Monday midnight. I then had to inform my 25 full and part-time employees that most likely we will have to shut down the restaurant immediately and they will be temporarily out of work. They were furious and didn't know what to say and how to react to the news. They were fearful of what this meant in terms of their income suddenly being gone. How will they pay their rent? How will they support their families and buy groceries? My first thought was to shut down the restaurant completely. I felt the restaurant would have a better chance of surviving if I cut all costs rather than staying open and paid the cost of wages, food, and utilities. I felt that these expenses would be far greater than the income from sales during this time of only takeout. Most restaurant profits are from 3% to 10%. Wages are a big part of operating costs, around 35% to 40%. Food costs are 30% to 35%. Rent is 7%, utilities 5%, and business insurance, worker compensation, routine maintenance, and other supplies had to be paid as well. Most restaurants would not be able to keep up with payments and fall hopelessly behind if they lose just 2 weeks of revenue. And the employees who work in the food service or hospitality industry will face hefty financial struggles. These employees depend on their hourly wages and tip from paycheck to paycheck. I told my employees to file for unemployment benefits right away, and that I will help them in any way I can. Some have asked me to write a letter to their landlord asking for a break on rent because of lost income. Monday, March 16th. We received notice that restaurants can open for takeout orders only. I was thankful because we didn't have to waste our food industry on hand before the shelter-in-place starts. We downsized our staff from 25 employees to 4 employees in just one day, 2 personnel during lunch hours and 2 during dinner hours. Meanwhile, we had to follow county protocols, which requires posting social distancing signage, maximum allowable persons on premise, and we were to provide sanitizing products for both employees and customers. We constantly watched the news for updated information and law requirements. It was difficult to find masks for staff. Everything was back ordered and would take 6 weeks to receive them. We contacted local sources to make masks for us in just a few days. Sales were only 15% of normal for about 4 weeks. Sales slowly increased to 20% by April 18th, and roughly 60% of our customer orders came through an online ordering system. Phone orders were 30% and counter orders were 20%. This is very different from normal when counter orders are 80% and online and phone orders were about 10%. Customer and order counts decreased from an average of 150 to 30 orders a day, with a significant decrease in wine and beer sales. Most takeout orders are for food only. There will be a tremendous impact on state tax revenues. The state tax revenue is only 20% of normal, and no sales tax will be collected for those businesses who have closed their doors to business completely. Saturday, March 28th. I have submitted an economic injury disaster loan through SBA directly online. I did not know how much I could apply for or how much I would qualify for. All I knew is that I needed to pay vendors for food and supplies. My profits would not be enough to pay these expenses. The EIDL online form was easy, but a lot to fill out. I was able to submit all documents requested. Now, all I have to do is wait for their response. An initial $10,000 grant payment was deposited into my bank business account on April 10th to help with a few bills. Friday, April 3rd. My banking institution, US Bank, contacted me because they were accepting applications for the bank payroll protection program. It was an easy form to fill out. I just had to show my payroll expense from 2019 tax return and submit payroll records to prove it. Now again, I'm waiting for a response. Finally, funding was electronically provided on April 17th. I am now able to pay my staff who have lost their income. I was able to compensate for their sick leave hours and bring them back to work or put them on payroll. I would not know what to do without these programs. They are the reason I will still be able to operate and compensate my staff while these business restrictions are in place. I have experienced many financial crises in the 20 plus years of operating my own business. For example, the 2001 9/11 attack was brutal. It shook up the economy big time. And the 2008 recession was tough as well. but I have never been forced to shut down my business like with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is something no one saw coming. I am wondering if this is going to happen again in the future. We are facing this new challenge of a new normal. I'm not sure if we will ever go back to where our life used to be, where we would meet and celebrate our moments together in public space. I very much enjoy and feel rewarded when I see my customers happy with food and service we offer. I strive to provide a place where family, friends, and companies can celebrate special moments of every occasion. I am hoping that we will find a way to recover from this pandemic and bring everyone back on board quickly. Monday, April 27th. 6 or 7 Bay Area counties are extending shelter in place till the end of May. I am working on new menu items to introduce to customers that will bring in revenues to allow us to stay open. We began offering family meals along with beer and wine to go. I am also planning to expand our website promotions and advertise to draw attention and sell our products. Even when this shelter in place is over, we will have to face social distancing requirements and follow protocols for gathering. It will be a long journey to get back to where my restaurant used to be. Thank you.
All right. So our next speaker is Roy Bahat. Roy Bahat leads Bloomberg Beta, an early stage venture firm backed by Bloomberg that invests in startups making work better with a focus on machine intelligence. Mr. Bahat is a commissioner on the California Future of Work Commission, a lecturer at UC Berkeley, the founding chairman of Ouya, a Kickstarter-based game console, and was the former president of IGN Entertainment. He was named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business and has served in government and led a nonprofit in addition to his work at established corporations and Day Zero startups. He graduated from Harvard College and was a Rhodes Scholar. Please welcome Mr. Bahat.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So I'm here to talk for just a few minutes and then I'll take questions about something that I wish I knew when I was in your shoes. My favorite class in high school was economics, and my economics teacher had a huge influence on me. I studied economics in graduate school and in college. And what I wish someone had told me is why a person should work for themselves. And let me explain why that is. When you're in school, people often tell you, like, work hard, study, get a job, do well in the job, make more progress. And I think that's totally true. All that is totally true. But then when I looked at some of the most successful people in history right now, and I'll just, whoever you think of as successful, but I'll tell you some of the people I admire, people like Martin Luther King or Oprah, or a celebrity like, Oprah's a celebrity and a celebrity business person is what I was going to say. Somebody like Mike Bloomberg, my boss. Those people work for themselves. And when you go through school, nobody really teaches you how to work for yourself. And so I want to talk a little bit about how you might think about it and then take your questions. And to be clear, I think that it's great to work for someone else. I work for someone else now. I've worked for myself. I started a video game company. Why should you work for yourself? I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the mentality you need, some of the skills and how to do it and what you might do next. So work for yourself. One reason is you'll just have more power over your own life. Instead of somebody telling you what to do, you get to make decisions for yourself. Second, you know that your work will matter in that it has a consequence. Let's say you work for yourself. My sister-in-law designs book jackets. She now works for a company, but she knows that if she were to work for herself, that every single thing she designed would be received by somebody and used. And the last thing, especially at a time like now when the world's so uncertain, working for yourself is the only job from which you can never be fired. And that's a pretty good thing at a time like this. But there is a very different mentality. In school, and I did really well in school, I worked hard, you win by getting the approval of somebody. You win by getting the approval of the teacher or scoring the right answer on a test. And the question about working for yourself is, what if you could win by learning how to approve of yourself, of how to set your own priorities, of how to be your own guide. And we don't really learn that in school. And there are some historical reasons for that that I'm happy to talk about. But the fact is that we really, in the most part, don't. There's some exceptions, like Fresno has a high school for entrepreneurship, but there are exceptions. So what are some of the skills? The number one skill is what I call learning to learn. That means you're going to constantly have to figure things out, and there's not going to be an instruction manual in front of you. So you got to seek people out who you can watch and learn from. You got to practice learning things. You're learning economics, learn how to understand math, learn statistics, learn human psychology, but just learn how to learn. The second thing is learning how to experiment. That the right thing in life is not to go into something knowing the right answer. It's to try something. And what goes with that experimentation is the skill of taking risks. And if you're good at taking risks, it doesn't mean that you're some crazy person. You know, Elon Musk once said, oh, I had to bet everything I had on Tesla. Well, I think that was stupid. And ideally, you'd be in a position not to have to bet everything you have. He had to maybe in that case. All right. But while it's really fun to take a big risk and have it pay off, you know, if you watch poker on TV, they put all the chips in the middle and then they win. That's bad. You don't want to have to bet the house because you don't want to lose the house. And so you have to protect yourself. The next skill is the skill of building things, which is the core thing when you work for yourself is you got to make something. And so there you learn things like focusing, not making things perfect. There's this saying, the perfect is the enemy of the good. You learn how to use tools. You know, you learn, for example, how to build a website. I was working with my son who wants to make a business swapping jigsaw puzzles because we all have, we don't want to buy new puzzles and wreck the environment, and we all have puzzles we finished before. And he was learning how to build a website using a tool called Webflow. And learn how to replace yourself when you're building things. You learn how to automate something you did. Maybe eventually you'll be in a position to hire somebody, and then you can grow and learn new things. So building. And then the other thing that goes with building is selling. It is extremely important to be able to explain what it is that you're trying to make so that somebody else wants it. And that's true whether you are a social worker. It's true whether you're a business person. It's true if you're writing a novel. It's true if you're making a song. So building and selling. And then the last thing is learning how to take care of yourself. One of the hardest things about working for yourself is that you have less of a system for self-care. That means paying attention to your body, trying to eat healthy, sleep enough, exercise your mind, making sure that you're giving yourself enough room. A lot of people I know practice meditation, and your spirit, depending what that means to you. It also means watching out for your family and friends and the broader role that you play in the society of being a good citizen. And that's, those are the basic skills of working for yourself. Other than that, it's a lot of common sense, do things that pass the grandmother test, that your grandma would be proud if you did it. And if you want to practice this and learn what to do next, I can give you some suggestions of things to read. I'll put some here in the chat, some books that have been very helpful for me in learning how to work for myself. And oftentimes people think that they need to be really ambitious right from the beginning. You don't. Those are some books that you can, I just put them in the chat, but maybe I don't have rights to put in the chat. Henry, I'm going to send them to you and you can put them in the chat. Those are some books. You may have to break up the lines between them. But one way to practice working for yourself is you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to go out and, not go to college and work for yourself and tell the system, see you guys later. Many of the people I know who work for themselves did it on the side at first. So Mark Zuckerberg made Facebook while he was in college as a side project. So side projects, which is to say something you are making while you are doing the core thing you're doing. And when you're in school, it's an awesome time to make stuff because, your height of your creativity, you have time to learn things, make side projects, practice things, and maybe one day you'll want to work for yourself. Maybe you won't. That's great too. A lot of the people I most admire didn't. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but that's how I think about it in my day job now. I invest in entrepreneurs. So we have a venture capital fund that invests in startups, and we often give people working for themselves some money to get to start to build the thing that they care about. So it's something I really believe in.
Okay, thank you
And that's it.
Bahat.
Yeah.
I think you gave us all some really good advice that's definitely going to be helpful in life. But we have a few questions about the work that you've done in the past and stuff. This one is from Matthew Cole. Well, he says, would you consider the franchise business model as working for yourself?
Yeah, I think that any time that you are, I assume in that case you mean not selling franchise, but buying a franchise. I think anytime you work for yourself, you exist in a market. You sell something to a customer. And so franchise is really just another way of being in a market. Now this gets at a kind of deeper philosophical truth, I think, which is really working for yourself is a mentality, not a job. And so you could have a boss, but think like I have employees. And there have been times in my life where I've thought of myself as serving the employees who work for me. And so in that sense, they kind of can work for themselves. There was a tech company, a video game tech company, where the CEO said, everybody's job is to be the CEO of something, some part of the company. So yes, I think franchisee is working for yourself. In fact, because I kind of think you can work for yourself in the context of anything, even though I was really talking about the context of like having that be your job.
Okay, that makes sense. This is from Andy Chen. He says, what are some examples in your career where you worked for yourself to become successful?
Well, become successful is the hard part because I hope to avoid ever scoring that about myself. I'm really proud of what I've done, but I also feel like I have a lot left to do. And I've never sat there and thought, wow, what a great success I am. So I'll tell you some things I've been really proud of instead. One is, together with a woman who I used to work with, we started a video game company, and we started a Google Doc where we had an idea for a $100 video game console that would be built on Android. Neither of us had ever built any hardware before, and step by step, brick by brick, we figured it out. And I think it was something like 7 or 8 months later, we had the first version of it sitting in our hands. And you could plug it into a TV and play games. So just that power of making something. If any of you have taken a computer programming class, sometimes they start with a hello world exercise where you like show hello world on the internet. Hello world, when you made something for yourself, is such an amazing feeling. So that's one. I also think there were times where I was just independent and I was working on projects. And at that time, one of the projects I did was writing a business plan for a political organization that was going to use data to try to reach voters. This is a long time before Facebook. And that was really, that was also really exciting to me. So those are a couple of things that I did when I was working for myself.
Really cool. So currently you have a firm that invests in startups. So we want to know, what are some of the most interesting startups that you've invested in?
Well, Slack, if you use Slack, that's a chat application. So we're investors in Slack. And then we invest very early. So many of the things we've invested in, you might not have heard of, but we've invested in everything from a robot that patrols offices at night to keep them safe, to writing software that as you're writing a job description or something like that, predicts the rest of what you're going to write and tells you, if you post this job description, how many people are going to, the quality of the people who are going to apply, and even what genders of people. Hey, change this word if you want to get more women to apply for this job, that kind of thing. And that uses artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a huge area of investment for us. We were actually the first investment firm to say that we wanted to focus on artificial intelligence. And so those are a few of the things that we invested in. We had a chance to invest in Zoom, but we missed it. And everybody makes mistakes.
Okay, this question is from Cheryl Wu. She says, how do you choose what companies to invest in? Like, what characteristics do you look for?
It's a great question. So one of the things we believe is that if you want to be good at something, you have to be willing to be wrong and improve. And one way that we're wrong, we often try to be wrong, is by sharing what we do in public so people can correct us. So you actually can go to our website, and I'm going to send Henry the link to that right now, and you'll see it redirects to a whole manual of all of the ways that we work that's hosted on GitHub. For those of you who program on computers, you see it on GitHub and it'll feel familiar. And there you'll see our criteria for investment. But I'll oversimplify it, which is we need one reason to believe that the company we invest in could be one of the best companies ever. It's got to be a good reason. And then we need to have a lot of other conditions satisfied, like we need to think that we know something about what they do. We need to think we can afford to invest. We need to think we can trust the founders of the company. And we lay it out in more detail there. But one way to think about an early investor is we're not sitting there like stroking our chins thinking like, is this going to be awesome? It's more like a game of taste, and you develop that taste through practice. And so the same way in the music business, there are people who do what's called A&R, which is the function, I think it's artists and repertoire. They're the people who like go on YouTube and try to find the emerging acts, or used to, before all this, hang out at a club or listen to some live band play a gig. They just develop a feel for it. The feel is based on reasons, but it's hard enough to articulate that I couldn't just tell you, here are 9 things and you can go do it. I could tell you those 9 things, and then you practice it and you'd say, Roy, you got 8 of those right and 1 of those wrong, that kind of thing.
All right, okay. And so how did you decide to move from being a founder to being an investor? And do you still consider yourself a founder?
Great question. Once a founder, always a founder. I'm always making stuff. My son wants to make this jigsaw puzzle thing. I want to work with him on it. So founder is a mentality. And I founded an investment firm, but that's a little different. The truth is, starting something is really hard. It's really hard. And that's why taking care of yourself is so important. One of the books on my list is called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and it goes a lot into the emotional side of starting something and running something. Part of it is I wanted to try something that'd be a little easier on me. And I kind of think your career often goes in these waves, kind of campaigns. You do something super intense for a while, then less so, super intense, less so. You can't flex your muscle all the time. And some of it is, I didn't like the way that investors treated entrepreneurs. And I wanted to see if I could do it better. And so I had a little bit of a desire to prove it. Now we're 8 years in. I think there's reason to believe that we could be a fantastic investment firm, but the jury's still out.
Okay, and going off on like entrepreneurship, what do you think the most important aspect of entrepreneurship is?
I think it's really hard to take entrepreneurship and boil it down to a single thing, because it's sort of like any other occupation. If I said, what's the most important part of being a musician? It's like, I don't know, you could say something to be some general thing like, oh, it's like having a sense of oneness with the music or something like that. But what does that really mean? It's a practice that you get into. My father was an architect, and I really have this idea in my head of what it means to have a profession, an occupation. And we tend to think of starting something as an exception to an occupation. Well, you can go be a police officer, an economist, or a teacher. Those are all wonderful things to be. And you can be an entrepreneur, but that's sort of like being a nothing. It's like being off on the side, starting something on your own. And I think that's nonsense. I think being a person who works for themselves, whether as a freelancer, meaning like you work on your own doing something that somebody pays you for, as an artist, or as an entrepreneur starting a nonprofit or a company, you know, I think those are all occupations that you could practice and get better at.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you. So Tia Guo asked, what is it like dealing with so much money and so many important people?
So first of all, the thing about money is no matter where you are on the ladder, you look up and you see people above you, and you look down and you see people beneath you. And I try to feel grateful for where I am and just keep at it. I used to work in government. So one of the things I did in my career was I worked in the New York City government. The truth is, in government, you deal with way bigger sums of money than you do in business. Because in government, they're talking billions of dollars to make a bridge, you know? And Mike Bloomberg, who built his own company over a period of more than 30 years and was mayor of New York and is now the UN envoy on climate change and all that, he has this great line about the difference between business and government, which I'll say is the same thing as the difference between big amounts of money and small amounts of money. He says, in business, it's dog eat dog, and in government, it's the other way around. And that's, I guess, my point, is that it's all very similar. I try to have real respect for the privilege that I get to do this, because I recognize that there are plenty of people who are suffering in the world and plenty of people who would like us to invest in them. So I try to carry respect for that. And at the same time, you kind of have to sometimes just look at it rationally and think, maybe it's just a number. So holding those two ideas in your head at the same time, that's one of the difficulties of being great at anything, I think, is being able to hold opposing, or not incompatible, but just very unlike thoughts in your head at the same time, something you could practice. Powerful people, honestly, my great secret is powerful people, and I have gotten to work for many of them. I used to work for the guy who ran Fox and News Corporation. I've been fortunate to meet many along the way. They're just like you and me. You know, we love to read these articles about like, what is different about these people? We're so similar, all of us, so much luck in life. And one of the nice things about being in the technology industry is you see these examples over and over of somebody who everybody counted out who ends up being a wild success. And one of the things that that's taught me is enormous respect. Like, why do I come speak with a group of students? Is because I don't know which of you are like wildly talented geniuses, whether an emotional genius or a mathematical genius or some other kind of genius. And each of you has that capacity in you. And so I try to have enormous respect for the fact that you just never know who the person might be who ends up being enormously successful. And I've found with powerful people, one of the opposing thoughts you should hold in your head when you talk to a powerful person, whatever that means, is one, you have to treat them like they're just like a human being like you. They don't want to be treated like a space alien. And the other is you have to treat them with respect. And, you know, for example, my son is a big Warriors fan, and he saw one of the players, I'm not that big a fan, so I don't even know who it was, when we were out at dinner at a restaurant. And he wanted to talk to him. He's like, do you think I could talk to him? And I said, yeah, he's just a person. You can walk up and talk to him, but you should treat him with respect. And he walked over and he said, Mr. Such and Such, you know, and didn't treat him like, hey, you're my buddy just because I see you on TV. And so that, you know, when you want to treat anybody, treat them as just another human being and treat them with respect.
Hey, that's really helpful. Okay, so we have time for one more question, I think. So how would you say that networking helped or changed your career? And do you have any suggestions for high school students on how they can start now or be prepared for the future?
Yeah, it's way easier now because the information is out there. I mean, when I was graduating high school, I literally bought a book of email addresses. And it was like, if you want to email the White House, here's the email address. There's so much information. Now, I also can make it harder because it's so overwhelming. But what I would say about networking is I tend not to think about it that way. I tend to think of it just as building relationships, although there is a book called like How to Network If You're an Introvert. Man, I'm embarrassed I can't remember the title. Karen Wickery is the author, W-I-C-K-R-E. I wrote the foreword for it. And my basic idea about building relationships is show up the way you would want somebody to show up if they came on your doorstep, which means try to offer something of value. And so, you know, if you show up and you're trying to reach out to somebody you don't know, like write a cold email to somebody who wrote a book that you love, you know, share something of value. Maybe it's like, hey, here's my story of how I loved your book, or offer something. If you show up asking for things immediately, it's a lot harder to build a relationship. People want to be treated as equals. And so show up by offering something. And look, if you have other questions, I love speaking with students. Time is my only constraint, but I'm easy to find on the internet. You know, look for me somewhere. If you can't find me, let me know somewhere else because that's my problem. I should be findable everywhere. Twitter is the place where I tend to have most of the conversations about things related to work. And you can see I updated my name here to be, so you can see my Twitter handle there. And it's a real honor getting to, you know, to come speak to a group of students like you. And by the way, networking, you guys are doing it right now. The fact is, like, a group like this one, it's amazing that this exists. So I think it's really cool that you guys are all doing this right now.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak with us today. Everything you said was really
helpful. And let me just tell you what, when I was getting set up, when Henry and Apurva, you were reaching out, thank you guys for organizing it. When I was communicating with the woman on my team who organizes events, I said, these guys are just as professional, if not more professional than most of the businesses we deal with. So whatever you guys are doing, keep doing it. You're doing it right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. All right, guys. Thank you. Bye.
So our next speaker will be Assistant Professor Ajay Shenoy from UC Santa Cruz. His interests primarily lie in the economics of development, economic growth, macroeconomics, and the political economy. His past work includes research on markets, poverty, income, and production. Please welcome Professor Shenoy.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Let's see. You all see a blank white screen? Okay. So I want to start you all with a very simple, straightforward question. Can a pressure cooker teach you math? So you might, okay, you're probably at this point wondering, like, who's this bozo that they let into the meeting? So let's turn to the data. So I could pull open the Integrated Household Development Survey from India. This is a survey of households in India. And we can say, okay, for each household, let's look at the average math score of the child and whether they own a pressure cooker. And lo and behold, you can see here that the people who own a pressure cooker, their children tend to score better on this math test. And so some of you might be thinking, okay, let's think of all the mechanisms, you know, maybe owning a pressure cooker lets you cook lentils, more chickpeas, whatever. And, you know, the extra protein helps brain development. And we could speculate on that, several different magical theories. The rest of you, I hope, are just sort of giving me an eye roll. Bravo. Something seems a little bit off about this hypothesis, doesn't it? And so one thing you might think is perhaps the households who own a pressure cooker might be different in some ways from the households that don't. And of course, lo and behold, we can also look at their income. See, the people who own a pressure cooker have much higher income, right? This is India, it's a poor country. So having a pressure cooker is kind of like having a Ferrari in the US, right? It's a nice item. It means that you're fairly wealthy. You can also look at the education of the adults in the household. So the highest education of any adult in the household. Definitely people who own a pressure cooker, the adults in that household are a lot better educated. And all of these things might have some consequences for the math scores of the children in the household, right? So what is the point of this? That correlation does not equal causation, right? The fact that the households that have a pressure cooker tend, on average, to have higher math scores among their children doesn't mean that the pressure cooker causes you to have a higher math score, right? And so that fact, I mean, everyone sort of repeats this. It's sort of like tautological. Correlation does not equal causation, or rather it's a true. Dental plaque and having bad teeth causes a heart attack. And so the reason people say this is because individuals who have poor dental health or do not have good access to dentists tend to also develop heart attacks. And you can think there might be many reasons why the people who don't have access to good dental care might be likely to develop heart problems, right? Maybe they don't have access to any kind of medical care. Maybe they can't afford to go to a doctor when they start to have problems with their heart. Maybe they can't afford to eat really healthy, right? But you see these kinds of studies all the time. And this kind of logic is really dangerous when you start to think about policy analysis, right? So suppose we're thinking about food stamps. Are food stamps good for households? And you might say, well, it appears that all of the households that are on food stamps also tend not to have jobs. They tend to be unemployed. Does that mean getting food stamps causes you to lose your job? Probably not, right? There's no reason why a food stamp would cause you to lose your job. Does being on heart medication cause you to have high blood pressure? I sure hope not. Otherwise, the FDA is not doing its job. Does a fire engine visiting your house cause it to burst into flames? I hope not as well, but that is the empirical correlation. Wherever they show up, the house tends to be on fire. So, I mean, at this point, I think I've made my point here. It is important to think hard about what is the difference between causation and correlation, and in particular, the places and the individuals that are subjected to a certain treatment or have a certain policy in place may be systematically different. There is a reason why they have that policy. So good example, let me walk you through a case study of a paper that I actually just finished with some of my co-authors recently, right? So the way an economist approaches this question, so there's some policy and you want to identify the actual impact of the policy. You don't want to confuse correlation with causation. What we do is we look for natural experiments, basically things that nature gives us that are kind of like a randomized control trial, how we test drugs, but they just sort of arise in nature. And so the question we were thinking about is social distancing in COVID-19. So this was a paper recently wrote with a bunch of grad students and also Kini Sangha, who is in private industry. And so the question we were approaching here is, how does early social distancing or earlier social distancing impact COVID-19 outbreaks? The reason why we care about this is now that states are starting to end their lockdowns, there may come a time in the future when we may have to re-enter these lockdowns. And so a question we could ask is, how important is it to start a little bit earlier? And the challenge here is you can't just compare states that lock down earlier to those that lock down later, right? Because over here, the ones that lock down the earliest is states like California, and down here you have states like Florida and Georgia, right? And so there's a very strong correlation. So the horizontal axis here is the date of the lockdown, the statewide lockdown. Vertical axis here is fraction within a college. Here it's fraction black. And you can see there's just systematic differences based on these scatter plots, right? So the states that lock down earlier are different from the ones that lock down later for reasons that are unrelated to the lockdown itself, right? Or rather, these are the things that predict the tendency to lock down. And so we don't want to confuse the impact of the earlier lockdown with these other factors and a host of other things that we can't even measure in the data, right? So how do we approach this? So our idea in this paper is to use rainfall as our natural experiment. Why? Because rainfall keeps people indoors. People don't like to go out. People don't necessarily like to go to restaurants or to bars or anything when it's raining outside. And the beauty of rainfall is that weather doesn't care if you're rich, it doesn't care if you're educated, doesn't matter how many hospitals your county has, doesn't matter how many pressure cookers are in your county, right? And so it's independent of those things, whether it rains today. So if we hold fixed whether your county tends to be rainy at this time of year, whether it happens to rain today or on a particular date, is kind of random, right? So the idea in the study is we're going to look at the first, so in a particular state, say Florida. Florida locked down on April 1st. And so all of Florida went under a lockdown order on that date. And so we look at the last weekend before that lockdown. And so that last weekend is sort of the last time that people, most people aren't working on the weekends. And so that's sort of their last chance to go out to restaurants, go out to bars, do things that are sort of fun, right? Discretionary. And we're going to look at counties within the state that were rainy and compare them to ones that are not rainy, right? Because in the ones that are rainy, it is as though they are staying home an extra weekend. It's almost sort of simulating this idea that you started distancing a little bit sooner. And so you can take this, and so this is basically our design, right? We need to think hard about the correlation versus causation, and we believe this rainfall thing, the effect that rainfall has on people staying home, it is going to cause people to stay home without being sort of correlated with these other things that we don't want to confuse with the effect of the social distancing itself. And so once we do that, we can see here, so this panel in this little scatter plot is, so the horizontal axis in both of these panels is rainfall, basically. And then the vertical axis in this is the percentage of households within a county that are leaving home. And you can see people don't like to go out when it rains, right? So more people are staying home in the counties where it rained harder on that last weekend. Now this panel over here is the number of COVID-19 cases per 100,000, 14 days after the lockdown, right? So 2 weeks later, how many people have COVID-19? And you can see it has basically the same pattern as the number of people leaving home, right? And so this is giving us sort of the causal identification, right? Because of the rainfall, so we can control for other environmental factors like temperature, et cetera, that we think might have a direct impact on COVID-19 transmission. And so then you're sort of left with just the random effects that like places where it happened to rain more also happen to have fewer COVID-19 cases. We don't think that could affect COVID-19 transmission except through its effect on people leaving home, right? And so we sort of like isolate the channel of causation from one of these, from leaving home to the cases. And we can see actually that the impact lasts for a very long time. You can measure it even out to 18 days after the lockdown. The effect just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So this initial early social distancing, we can sort of conclude had very big effects on subsequent transmission, right? Surprisingly big effects. And so that's basically, we have not a lot of time today, so I'll sort of leave you with that. So kind of the conclusions here, think about the fact that correlation doesn't equal causation. That one example I gave you is sort of the way an economist would think about this. How do we design a good study that thinks hard about the potential biases and somehow uses natural experiments to get around those? Most important point, pressure cookers do not teach you math.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Shenoy. Would you have time for a few questions? I know you're on a little bit of a time crunch, but.
Sure.
Okay, so we had one question from Marcus Quo, and he asked, have you seen any real life examples of someone or a group confusing correlation and causation, like in their research?
So I think the example of the plaque is pretty clear, but this is actually something that differs by discipline. I have noticed, for example, in certain disciplines, there is a greater concern with correlation and causation. So economics is famous for being the most obsessed with this, basically because we have an entire theoretical framework that suggests that people make choices for a reason. So the households that choose to be part of some program are probably different from the ones that don't. But there are certain disciplines that don't seem to care as much. So I think like public health and nutrition, those fields are kind of notorious for this in that they either have randomized control trials, which are like gold standard, but other than that, it oftentimes tends to be these sort of observational studies, like the plaque one. But you will see many, many examples of this. So you can keep an eye out for it as you read for newspaper accounts of studies from like nutrition or from other fields of public health, where they will say like there's this factor that is associated with this outcome, and then they will strongly imply that it's actually causation.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And also, it's really cool how you applied economic principles to an area that's like not necessarily attributed to the economy or money. And like, what other areas do you think you could apply these principles to?
So economists are notorious for studying whatever you want. So this paper falls broadly into the area of health economics. So this is often a point of, people tend to think economists basically spend all of our time like, I don't know, looking at the stock market or something. Most of my research these days is on political economy and corruption. I've also had papers on like gerrymandering. There are papers that look at, so for example, coups and the extent to which individuals outside of, say, the CIA or secret agencies that carry these things out, how well they learn about them. Papers on conflict, warfare. So economics basically is, to be an economist, you just have to think hard empirically about policies that affect society, right? And so in some sense, you can find economists working on almost anything. What sort of makes us economists is the approach we take to those questions. In particular, this idea of research design. And that has, to a certain extent, spread to some other fields as well. So the political scientists, in particular, think hard about this as well now. And now sociology is as well, right? So it's not just us anymore, but we are the ones who place arguably the heaviest emphasis in that this is kind of like, you kind of have to think this way in order to be working within economics.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you so much for coming today. Your research was really interesting. I never even thought about like comparing the two, but it was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, guys. Good luck for the rest of your talks, and good luck for the rest of your year.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now we have an 8-minute intermission till 5:40, and then we'll continue with our next speaker, Scott Baker.
And also, I know a lot of you guys wanted the link to Professor Shenoy's paper, so we'll link that in the chat box soon.
And the book that Roy Bahat was talking about.
Hey, Nile, how's it going?
Hi, Professor Baker. Yeah, we're having a short intermission right now, so
Sounds good.
we'll begin back with your speech at 5:40, 5
Okay,
minutes. Thank you.
sounds good.
Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, we'll be starting in 1 minute.
All right, guys. Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker, Professor Scott Baker. He's an associate professor of finance at Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, and he completed a PhD from Stanford and his BA at UC Berkeley. I'm so glad he could be with us here tonight. His research is mainly concentrated in empirical finance and macroeconomics, and he's engaged in a variety of research projects in empirical finance and macroeconomics, and measurement of consumption, and the effects of policy uncertainty on financial markets and growth. Please welcome Professor Baker.
All right. So it's it's fun to have you guys invite me. Thanks so much. I spent many years back in the Bay. Let me get the right screen shared here. So always good to chat with some Pacific time folks. So yeah, this paper I'm going to be kind of presenting a little bit of work that's kind of the intersection of two papers. A little bit of one and a little bit of another. Both of them have to do with kind of household spending during this recent COVID-19 kind of pandemic. So there's joint work with a number of other folks from a range of universities. And we've been kind of teaming up to think about COVID-19 and kind of household spending, as well as how this might affect the macroeconomy. So as you all are probably aware, there's been quite a bit of economic upheaval as well as political upheaval from the COVID-19 pandemic. Neely, actually, how long do you want me to go, just so I can time things?
So we were planning a 15-minute presentation and 5-minute Q&A.
Very good. Okay, I'll aim for that. So what we want to do is kind of look at some of how households responded to both the epidemic itself, but also to some of the pieces of government policy that were passed kind of in response to the epidemic. So I'm going to present some brief results from two papers. One is about how households responded to the kind of first part of the pandemic and some of the shelter-in-place policies. And then the second paper is basically about how households responded to the this recent stimulus payments that came out in April and are continuing to roll out in May. Just as a kind of basic idea here, the first paper is mostly basic facts about consumption spiking and then declining around these shelter-in-place policies. We're going to look at some differences in responses across different sorts of demographics, income groups, liquidity, political affiliation. We certainly find that there are big effects of these shelter-in-place policies in terms of how households kind of go about their spending. And then the second component with the household stimulus, we're again going to look at really high frequency measures of household spending and how they were affected by these stimulus checks arriving. All right. And yeah, one kind of key component here is that about the stimulus checks is that we're going to find that liquidity, so basically like checking account balances, how much money you have in the bank, is going to play a really important role in how households tend to respond in the near term to these stimulus payments. Okay. So some kind of main findings. I'm going to tell you about the data, tell you about kind of our strategy, but just to give a brief outline, we find that kind of when these shelter-in-place policies were enacted or announced, we've actually find a big spike in spending on things like retail, credit card spending, food items, lots of different areas as people go out and like stock up on lots of goods, or maybe go out and for the last time to a restaurant or to their favorite retail store. These changes are stronger in places with shelter-in-place orders. And we do see that kind of greater levels of social distancing tend to be associated with drops in spending, especially in things like restaurants and retail. On the stimulus side, what we're going to show is households respond pretty rapidly to the stimulus payments. So in the first about 2 weeks, these households spend about 30 cents on the dollar of their stimulus payments. So if you're getting a stimulus check of $1,200, in the first couple of weeks, they're spending about 400 of it. We find these effects are much stronger for people with lower income and especially lower levels of like assets, lower levels of liquidity. To tell you a little bit about the data, we're going to use transaction level data from linked accounts from a nonprofit fintech company called SaverLife. So this service basically allows people to work, track their income and spending and budgeting. It's like a savings app or an app that people might use for that, or just to keep track of their income and spending. And so we can actually observe every transaction that's kind of flowing out of their credit card or into their checking account or out via their debit card. We have about 45,000 users that we're going to be examining. We observe lots of demographic information that's self-reported: gender, age, where they live. And the nice thing about this data, it has some trade-offs in terms of representativeness and kind of selection and size, but it's nice that it can be updated really frequently. So as of today, what's today, the 29th, I think, right? The 30th, 29th. We have data already up through the 24th. Okay, so we can update this data quite frequently and gain some kind of new insights. All right. So what do we see? Okay, so these are basically residuals. So we're trying to strip away things like month fixed effects and average changes in spending that typically occur on different weeks of the year or days of the week, and we're looking at kind of deviations from that. And here we're looking at in the period of time around when a lot of these shelter-in-place policies were started to be enacted in kind of late February, early March. And what we see is that there's these big spikes in spending. So here we have all spending and grocery spending. But basically, there's a big surge in spending where spending nearly doubles in some cases and in some states, and then kind of rapidly falls off as the shelter-in-place policies kind of kick in. And we see this across lots of categories. So this is a very common trend. You look across all retail spending, you look across food delivery, public transit, credit card spending, air travel spending, and this seems to be a very common trend. So people are kind of going out, they're taking public transit places, they're flying back home, they're stocking up on goods, they're buying new things to work from home, and then the shelter-in-place policies are going into effect, and you see this spending kind of drop off a cliff. Another thing that had been brought up, and one thing that we wanted to look at, is that there were a bunch of papers and a lot of research and polls and things like that kind of Republicans were less likely than Democrats to engage in social distancing or kind of think that COVID was a big deal. So we wanted to test whether this actually had an impact on kind of observable spending, right? There's lots of papers previously that have shown, people kind of have cheap talk, right? They say one thing but maybe do another. And so what we look at is we try to impute what sort of political affiliation people have. We're actually running a survey to validate this approach right now. Not quite done yet, but based on that, so in the pre-period here, let's see. Oh, I can't annotate on here. Okay, never mind. All right, no annotation. In the pre-period, February, January, not much difference at all. You do see a bit of spread with kind of Republicans, if anything, responding by more in kind of late February, early March, and stocking up more. Some of this is just driven by the fact that Republicans tend to have a bit bigger families, and people with bigger families tended to stock up more on groceries and things like that, or people with kids. But then they both kind of fall in tandem. And so by kind of late March, early April, the levels of spending across people who we think are Democrats and those who we think are Republicans looks very, very similar. And so this might be a case of, they're kind of polling differences in what people say, but really they're taking it relatively similarly, at least in terms of the spending that they're doing. Okay. All right. Okay. This is just that in kind of table form, in regression form, instead of as a figure. We can see basically differences across columns. We're splitting into states that had shelter-in-place orders in place and those that don't. So for instance, column 2 versus column 3 is looking at overall spending, how it's changing across these different time periods in states in column 2 where there's a shelter-in-place policy versus column 3 where there was never a shelter-in-place policy put into effect. And what we see is that these increases in spending in the pre-periods and also the declines in spending after the shelter-in-place policies go into effect are much stronger, right? So kind of higher positive numbers in the first rows and bigger negative numbers, lower negative numbers in the bottom rows. So it's basically saying that spending was falling by about 50% relative to what we might have expected from like previous years of spending. All right. The second thing I want to talk about a little bit is some results from what happened, what households did after receiving these stimulus checks. And this is kind of an important question because more stimulus checks are being considered by Congress and by the federal government in general. And so, we wanted to put out some information about, how effective these have been about, stimulating the economy, helping people to spend and to cover, critical expenses. So what happened in March, this was a part of a larger bill called the CARES Act that did lots of things and had lots of kind of bailouts and different sorts of programs that sent money to businesses and to all grants to states and all sorts of other things. But one big component were these direct stimulus checks to households. So these checks were based on household size, so about $1,200 per adult and $500 per child. The first payments were made in mid-April, and then continuing through, there's still checks coming out now. The first ones were done via direct deposit, and then checks kind of coming later. There was a phase out in income for high income people. These payments started phasing out. Our sample is a little bit lower income, so we don't have that many people kind of in that income range that we think are going to be phasing out. So what we do to identify these payments in the data, again, if you recall, we have this data that's transaction level data. And so we look for transactions that exactly match the size of the stimulus checks that were coming in. So we can't be 100% certain that these transactions are stimulus checks, but if you look in the data at the frequency of transactions that match those exact sizes, they're basically never present except when these stimulus checks start coming out, as you can see kind of after April 9th. So we're pretty sure we're identifying the timing and the people who are getting these stimulus checks pretty accurately. And what we can do is we can use people who haven't received or are not eligible for stimulus checks as kind of a control group. Okay, so this is looking like a differences in differences approach, and saying if we kind of say their normal spending would be the level of spending that these other folks are engaging in, what's the kind of deviation? What's the excess spending that we detect from the people who receive these stimulus checks? And you can see that on the x-axis, this is the time until payment of the stimulus check. So on the left, to the left of this vertical bar is before the stimulus checks come out. And you essentially see no difference between the people who get the checks and those who don't in terms of their spending. And then you see a giant spike, okay? The y-axis here is scaled by the size of the stimulus check. So a value of say 0.05 means that on that day, they spent 5% of the stimulus check extra. Okay, so if a stimulus check is $2,000 and they were spending 5% extra, this is going to be $100 extra on that day. Okay, and so you can see this tapers off, that most of the effect seems to be in the first couple weeks, and then spending kind of returns to normal. All right, so if you sum this up, the total excess spending is about 30 cents on the dollar. All right, and so the other 70 cents seem like they haven't really been spent yet, or people are saving it for kind of future expenses. Right, they might not be sure how long this crisis is going to last for. So there was a question here, where the stimulus spending is being spent then, if that's the aggregate effect. The BBC helpfully wrote this article saying it was being spent on food, bidets, and guns. We can break this out into categories. So we can not only look at overall spending, but we can look at different types of spending. And so a lot of this seems to be spent on kind of non-durable goods, household goods, food expenditures, and actually not that much on durables. This is like things like new cars. And this is something that responded a lot in previous recessions and previous stimulus checks. Durables responded a lot, and we're not seeing that in this recession. Okay. The last thing that I want to mention is kind of the heterogeneity in the effect. Right. So what we're showing here is the aggregate MPC. Okay, so there's a marginal propensity to consume out of these stimulus checks, the extra spending that's generated by these stimulus checks, and it's summed over the entire period after they received the check. Right. So a value of 0.3 means that they spent in the period after the check came in, they spent 30 cents on the dollar. And we're splitting here. We're running 4 separate tests across individuals with different levels of monthly income. Right. So on the right, you have people earning more than $5,000 a month post-tax. On the left, less than $1,000 a month. All right. And you can see that the spending responses are much, much larger for people who with lower levels of income, much smaller for people with high levels of income. We see the same thing to an even larger extent if we split by how much money is in their bank account. All right, so for people who have under $500 in their bank account at the time the stimulus checks rolls in, they're spending 35 cents on the dollar or more. All right, if we look at people who have over $3,000 in their bank account, they're spending virtually nothing. They're essentially saving the whole thing. Okay, and so this is basically saying, if you're thinking about stimulating the economy, having a high what we call fiscal multiplier of this federal spending, it might be a good idea to target. Or this could also kind of alternately be a signal that there are a lot of people who were very constrained and not having a lot of savings. Maybe they had just lost their job, and these stimulus checks were kind of exceedingly important for them, enabling them to make a lot of kind of near-term expensive payments or expenses and payments. Okay, so I think that was about 15 minutes. Let me sum up and just say, what we wanted to get across here was just some early results on the consumption effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to deal with this, in order to make some of these policy decisions, policymakers have to kind of understand what's going on, and a lot of the traditional indicators that the government has to work with are pretty slow to come in, and they might take a number of months or even quarters to get accurate data. And so we think we're trying to provide a service here, kind of showing what some of the immediate effects of these stimulus payments are, and also the kind of shelter-in-place policies. So that's all I had to talk about. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Professor Baker.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So we just had a few questions. This one is from Matthew Williams, and he said that he read an article recently that brought to light the possibility that the extra federally supported $600 unemployment stipend is slowing the recovery of the economy. And so, what are your thoughts on that? And is there any evidence of this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one thing that we looked at. We actually looked at, if consumption responses differed by if people looked like they, I don't know if this messes up the share. I'm going to bring your faces into the main screen here. Is that sharing your faces then, or? Okay, let me stop the share then. Okay, just because I don't want to be looking off to the side. Anyway, so one thing we did is look at people who seemed like they lost their job recently to see if they responded more to the stimulus payments, and they really didn't. And I think a lot of that is that these giant unemployment insurance checks are kind of rolling out, and so this alleviated a lot of the near-term pressure, right? The replacement rates of these UI payments are like more than one in a lot of cases for lower income folks, which is pretty unprecedented. Usually replacement rates are something like 30%. So if you lose your job, a UI check is going to replace about 30% or 40% of your income, and now the $600 weekly checks have boosted that to, if you get fired, you actually make more money. So I imagine that the article is kind of talking about people don't want to go back to work because they're getting more money, getting UI. Now, I mean, that is definitely going to slow the recovery. I mean, some of the reason that they were paying out that much is to keep people from going to work, to increase social distancing or what have you, or make people not feel as pressured to go in and potentially spread COVID. So I mean, it definitely has there's kind of pluses and minuses. If we're trying to reopen, then it's definitely going to be an impediment that some people aren't going to want to take their jobs back if they're going to essentially get a pay cut and have to go back to work.
Okay, and also we have time, I think we have time for one more question. This is from Dhruv, and he asks, do you think there is an overabundance of mathematical modeling in economics in relation to the amount of economic history taught?
That's a good question. So, I mean, there's definitely a big debate, and it's something that, the PhD students are very much pushed. So if you want to go into a PhD, you've got to get very teched up, very mathed up. The first year is all math. And certainly there's a lot of models. I think models are super useful. They are, they're a way of clarifying thinking, I think. And they kind of force you to understand exactly what you're kind of trying to say. I'm more of an empiricist, but I think I try to use models where I can to kind of illustrate things and to really highlight. I mean, just kind of make some of the mechanisms more clear. I think that there is a lot of economic history. So I'm at Northwestern, and in the business school and in the econ department, there's actually a lot of economic historians. So actually, I just had a talk. One of my PhD students today is kind of going down that route as an economic historian, and he was doing some work about doing some work in the Great Depression and looking at kind of old census data and old city records from there. I think there's still a lot of room there, and one thing economists kind of distinguish themselves in the historical research is still bringing in a lot of kind of mathematic and quantitative rigor relative to some of the other social sciences that rely more on a narrative approach. And I think that's really valuable. That it's great to have these historical archives and these interesting sources of data, but I do think that you need to also kind of bring some statistics and math to bear.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Baker. It was very interesting listening to your presentation. Thank you so much for giving your time to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Have a good night, guys. This seems like a really cool club. Happy to participate. All right. Have a good night. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, everyone. Next up, we have Professor Mark Brady, who teaches principles of macroeconomics, principles of microeconomics, and macroeconomic analysis at San Jose State University. He also teaches economics at De Anza College in Cupertino and previously taught in schools, colleges, and universities in Britain, Ireland, and California. He's particularly interested in economic history and the history of economic thought. Please welcome him and his presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Further on what you just said, I have in recent years taught every fall history of economic thought and economic history of Europe, as well as the other things that you talked about, other topics. Anyway, I'm going to present myself as a student, not as an instructor of economics and history. And my background goes back, like the first time I did economics at high school was in 1964. So my knowledge of economics goes back 56 years. And even in terms of history, it goes back further than that. Anyway, I'm very interested in economics. I've stuck with it. And I'm very interested in history. So that's my formal education. But actually, as much as anything, it's not just formal education, it's teaching experience. And there is the old jibe by the playwright George Bernard Shaw, which was those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach people to teach, which may have some truth to it. On the other hand, though, I don't think there's anything like teaching to really understand things if you're going to be a successful teacher. If you're going to get ideas across, you've got to be able to understand it and relate it to people. And that's what I really enjoy doing. So that's my background. All right, first of all, here are some thoughts I'm going to share with you, and then I'll willingly take questions. And you can always email me afterwards. Okay. We're told a lot about the facts, okay, the facts. But first of all, there is a remarkable amount of ignorance, not surprisingly, about coronavirus, the current coronavirus, COVID-19. It's not surprising, right? And depending on where you go, you read different stories, right? I was struck from way back in March how diverse was the take on coronavirus, on the coronavirus. Well, actually, there's more than one, but the COVID-19, all right? I was struck by how much diversity. I don't know whether any of you guys explored this, but way back, we go back 2 months and more, and you'll find a considerable disparity about the basic facts of what they're purporting to be, basic facts of COVID-19 and the consequences of particular policies, which they're inferring from this. And thereby people, respectable people, in the following sense, they would be called experts, right? But people call the experts they like, they call them experts, and the other ones they ignore. So, but there's a lot of actually, particularly outside of the United States and outside of the UK, in Europe, you'll find there's a lot of dissident voices, and there have been for 10 weeks or more. If you go to mshfd.org. It's just been created, and there's also parallel sites in France and Germany. You're going to find a lot more going up there. But, you know, you do a search and you come across it. You may be aware of the guy at Stanford who, what is he, Ionides, who came up with rather contrary views. But there's a lot of other people out there. And as far as I can tell, they're just as respectable and just as entitled to their views as people who get more attention. And I want to come back to that, about more attention. Okay, so, and the other thing is this, even if we were to establish certain facts, what weight do we give to different facts? You see, all these statements, a bunch of statements could be true, but what weight do we attach to them? And we don't necessarily know that. Okay, so as a historian, I'm interested in the history, mildly, I am not an authority, the history of epidemics. And what I always teach in my economic history of Europe is the Black Death, which, by the way, did not reach Iceland, but extended through much of Europe and had a profound impact on the political economy, the institutional structures and the economics of Europe. And it got to the Middle East, it got to India. Okay, so there's that take on it. We could talk about that. All right, I'm not a biologist. My father was a botanist. And he was also the principal of the high school which I attended, for what that's worth. And he also taught me economics. He was a very good teacher. But I'm not going to profess to know any more biology than I acquired in my youth, adolescent youth. All right, and that's pretty rusty. All right, and we never did epidemiology or anything like that. I did, however, guys, live through, although I don't remember, living through the flu epidemic in 1957 and the so-called Chinese virus of 1968-69. Again, I really don't remember it. Right? I really don't remember. I have friends and contemporaries who do sort of remember it. Look at the data on the death rate with the 57 epidemic or the 68-69 epidemic. It is a very interesting question. How would society today have reacted to those sort of epidemics at the time? That's a very interesting question. And it raises some profound questions, which is about how people view death. We get into very philosophical, religious, metaphysical questions. How do people regard death? Are people of my generation and older less worried about death? Actually, it's a very interesting question. And I know it's seriously argued that people today are more obsessed with, are we going to die? And that can determine public attitude, that can determine public policy. Okay, I don't want to die, and I don't know anybody who does, but it's interesting though, how we take to it. All right. I want to go back to work, by the way. I want to in-person classes. I'll wear a mask if need be. Ask other people to wear masks, but I don't want to be isolated. Okay, but you got me in as an economist, as an instructor of economics. I'm not a professor, by the way. I'm just an instructor, just a lecturer. All right, but with some experience, I hope. All right, and that's about the economic, I'm keeping an eye on the time here, the economic way of thinking, all right? And as you all know from having done economics or even just participation in the economics forum today, economics is about scarcity. It's actually a little bit more than that. It's about scarcity of resources that are capable of alternative uses, and that there is a ranking of the goals. Unless you have those caveats, you do not have an economic problem. By the way, that's not very limiting. Pretty much everything we experience is about a scarcity of means that are capable of satisfying more than one goal, and we have a ranking of those goals. That goes back to Lionel Robbins, 1932. All right. Now, I'll discuss, I made a list here of topics I could briefly talk about, 1 minute each. All right, here we go. Trade-offs. You hear a lot about trade-offs. The question is, we all make trade-offs. And when a lot of the talk about trade-offs is extrapolating to the powers that be your trade-off. But no, the powers that be have different trade-offs. They have different trade-offs. They may, to some extent, you know, sort of try to take into account what they view to be your trade-offs and popular trade-offs. But primarily, people in politics want to get re-elected, right? Don't forget that. And if they found they made a serious mistake, they're unlikely to admit it. So how do you get out of that, out of the present lockdown, if it turns out that we made mistakes in the past? And then you've got to do it in such a way that you can avoid the criticism, right? We all make trade-offs, but don't extrapolate your idea of a trade-off to what is made by public officials, or for that matter, elected public officials, or to that matter, the bureaucrats who administer the system. They all have their own trade-off systems. They all have their own trade-offs. What do government officials confront? Now, one thing they talk about, I guess we don't impersonally talk about it as much when we make a trade-off, is how do you value human life? That's an interesting question. You can talk to economists who specialize in this. They have a notional values of human life that turn on the age of the people, right? They may not correlate with your value of human life, of your human life. So, you know, bear that in mind. The next principle is marginalism, right? The so-called marginalist or marginal revolution of the 1870s, which actually was preempted by analysis that essentially came 40 years earlier. Little known fact, actually, even by economists. But the marginalist argument is that everything is at the margin, right? Okay, a little bit more lockdown, a little bit less lockdown, right? Do we raise taxes by 10% or by 5%? Everything is marginal, and we've got to look at things, if we're economists, in marginal terms. The next thing, and this tends to get neglected, but if you remember the Austrian School of Economics, you do emphasize it, and that is the subjectivism of everybody. I've already alluded to this, but it's the extreme subjectivism. Well, there's variants of subjectivism. I'm not necessarily an extreme subjectivist, but there is a subjectivism. Your perception is governed by the situation in which you find yourself and how you view these things. And there isn't some objective trade-off, right, that's out there that we can apply. Each individual has their own particular trade-offs. I dare say Governor Newsom is very much concerned to get re-elected, or if he's not that, he perhaps contemplates running for the Senate, or maybe eventually a presidency, right? These things all enter into his head, right? And he's got to get through the present crisis. Okay. Next thing, and you may be familiar with this, certainly if you've taken the economics course, is unintended consequences, right? And there is the famous difference between known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and that's associated with Cheney, the defense secretary. But the distinction was made before, right? Okay, distinction was made before. I'll keep my hands down. Okay, I mustn't get too excited here. All right, now, known unknowns is knowing that we don't know about certain things. And I'm struck by how little we don't know, it seems to me, and how little that is unacknowledged by people in public policy and public affairs. Although to some extent it is acknowledged. And then there's unknown unknowns. In other words, they're not things we even think about. Okay, they're not things we even think about, but they could be very important. All right, so there are these unintended consequences of human action, including government action. And in a way that was illustrated by the remarks, some of the remarks of our last speaker, actually. If you were listening to it and you go back and think about it again, or perhaps re-listen to it, you know, what we don't know and what people don't know, and therefore what they don't know, they can't really influence them, you see. Anyway, this brings us on, and somebody did at least one, I think it was the guy, previous speaker, someone talked about political economy. A word that is sometimes used, I think it's a bit overused actually, but is public choice. And that's about how people in government make decisions, which can be very different from how you think people in government ought to make decisions, or how you believe people in government make decisions. No. It's known as public choice. It's called public choice because it's contrasted with private choice in markets, In public choice, it's the bureaucrats, it's the politicians, elected politicians, elected executive, elected legislators, judges, everybody, right? Now, it's not saying, I want to make this very clear, it's not arguing that they're all there ready to take bribes. That's not the point. I think, for all I know, most people in government in California are not susceptible to bribes, although one has to add the marginal insight, which is how much more do you have to pay them in order to be subject, in order to influence their decision, right? Okay, and there's different ways of influencing people's decisions. You write a check to Mr. Newsom, he's not going to accept it. But you say, well, I'll contribute to your re-election campaign, maybe he will listen to you. Anyway, all these things are to do with public choice, which is how people behave in government. And in a broader sense, it's part of political economy, and often the word political economy is used to include public choice. All right, I see, well, I've gone over time, 6:16. Give me one more minute, please. And that is macro consequences. Okay, well, we've had some of that already from our previous speaker. All I would warn you about is, and this is not a jibe at our previous speaker, but I would, and I think you agree with me, is you've got to be very careful when you aggregate the activities of individuals as you do in macroeconomics. I teach macroeconomics, I think it's valuable, but there's a lot of caveats to it, at which point I will conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brady.
Thank you so much, Professor Brady, the president.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come speak with us.
You're welcome.
Our next speaker is Assistant Professor George Bulman from UC Santa Cruz. Assistant Professor Bulman teaches applied microeconomics and econometrics at UC Santa Cruz. Previously, he worked as a budget analyst for the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. He has conducted research in areas of higher education, as well as in applied public and labor economics. Please welcome Professor Bulman.
Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen. I know you guys have been at it for close to 2 hours now, so thank you for hanging in there for one more talk.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, happy to do it. So can you see this?
Yeah.
Maybe make it full screen mode. All right, I have some slides here. Hopefully you can see those. Great. My research has largely focused on transitions to college. So who goes to college and why and what happens to them once they get there. And I know you've had a couple of people speaking to you today, my colleague Ajay Shenoy, and I saw just when I came on Scott Baker, who was my classmate at Stanford. And these people are somewhat younger and faster than I am at producing research. So I certainly have not done any new COVID research. But what I'd like to talk about today is sort of how prior results that we have in this economics of education literature can give us some insight about what might happen and what factors could play out during this transition that we're experiencing right now. So just to give you a really brief introduction, the economics of education is basically studying the limited supply of goods in education and how they're allocated and what policies seem to work for human capital investment. So obviously K through 12 and college education are huge public and private investments from sort of the personal level, your family investing in college, also state government and county government investing in public schools. And it has important implications for future earnings and all kinds of life outcomes. And it involves individual and household decision-making. So some, I think, of the longest lasting impacts of COVID-19 and the policy response to COVID-19 are going to be due to these disruptions and changes in the education system. So there are probably some things that are happening right now that will be sort of short-lived, where, hey, we might be back in a year, we might be back in 5 years. But some of the impacts that this is going to have on children's educations could be still education and everything that happens for them. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of these things are some of the longest lasting impacts. My research has focused mostly on college transitions, but I certainly have some thoughts on K-12 education, perhaps as a result of having a 7-year-old who was sent home from first grade and has been getting homeschooled for the last 2 months, which has made me think a little bit more about some of these questions. So let me dive right into this. So college transitions, I think there are sort of 3 college transitions that I'd like to highlight. The first is the transition from high school to college. So why do people go? Is it about money? Is it about information? The other sort of key step in college is between the first and second year. That's when people tend to drop out of college. And then the third is this transition from the college to the labor market. And I think that's a really understudied area, but there are some interesting papers out there that have important implications for what's going on right now. And I think each of these transitions is likely to be significantly affected by both COVID-19 and the policy responses that we've seen. So let me I'm going to sort of go backwards. I'm going to start with the college to labor market transition because I think it sort of sets the table for the other 2. So I've committed cardinal sin number 1, which is putting too much on a slide, but I'm going to run with it anyway. So there's this really cool result in economics that basically shows that if you are unlucky enough to graduate when the economy is bad, that sticks with you for a long time. So the basic idea is that if you graduate, let's say in a time when there's a high unemployment rate, say 10% instead of 4%, you end up sort of getting underplaced in a less good job or with a less good company. And it takes a long time to overcome that. So once you've sort of gotten locked into that job, it's sort of hard to move back up. And so there are results, for example, a couple of well-known papers by Lisa Kahn and Phil Oriopoulos and co-authors that find that a 5% increase in the unemployment rate reduces initial earnings by 10%. And the reason behind that is that you graduate from college, instead of competing with, say, 4% of all people in the economy are competing with 10%. So it's a huge amount of extra competition when you're trying to get a job, and those people are often going to be more experienced than you. They just got laid off. And so it creates a really terrible environment for the recently graduated. And so we also see some of these results at the high school level. It's a little bit different, but you see more people, rather than getting paid less, they're just unemployed or choose to just stay at home, for example. And as I'll mention on the next slide, you also see some people being more likely to go to college because they don't really have a job opportunity out there. New graduates end up being hurt when there's a bad economy, much more than other people who are fine as long as they can sort of hang on to their job. So, I mean, I know right now the unemployment rate, depending on which measure you use, is around 15%. So I haven't seen the numbers yet, but I imagine that the current set of college graduates is experiencing a lot of pain right now. Because if they didn't have a job lined already, then it's going to be very, very hard to find one. And I imagine that even some of those people who thought they had a job lined up are losing that opportunity or finding out that it's not there for them anymore. So it's going to be a pretty tough transition for them. And then one of the interesting things about that result is that the people who bounce back within 5-10 years and sort of get to where they would have been if they'd graduated in a better economy, they tend to be the people who went to the best colleges and majored in sort of the most employable fields. So if you go to Stanford and you major in computer science, you're going to sort of bounce back much more than if you major in some sort of like soft social science or humanities at a lower ranked place. Then it's going to be a much more permanent effect on you. So it's kind of an interesting result. And I think that has really important implications for what's going on right now, because we could see this effect this year, but if the unemployment rate stays high, that could go on for the next year and future years as well. So from there, I think we can talk about the transition from high school to college. So the high school to college transition is going to be potentially impacted by this in a number of ways. So the first and most obvious thing is that people, they get a household resource shock. So when we have this COVID-19 downturn, all of a sudden you've got parents who are unemployed, and that may affect people's college decisions. And so interestingly, the literature here is kind of mixed. So probably the best paper on the impacts of parental job loss is Hilger's 2016 paper, and he actually found very small effects. So when parents lost their jobs when the kids were 17, 18 years old, when they were juniors or seniors in high school, he did not find a huge impact on whether or not the kids ended up going to college, which sort of suggested that they didn't face binding financial constraints. And actually, in a paper that I wrote with 3 co-authors, we found a similar result. So we actually exploited people who won the lottery right around the time they were juniors and seniors in high school, and we did not find big impacts of that additional resource on going to college. So from that perspective, it may not be that the job loss happening right now has a huge impact on whether or not high school students decide to go to college. But I guess we'll see. This will be certainly a huge shock to test that. But one of the competing factors here is that there are so few jobs available for high school students that I think college might seem like a very sort of good use of your time. If you know you're not going to get a decent job coming out of high school, then you might be like, yeah, I'm going to go take some community college classes instead and actually spend my time well, rather than just being at home and unemployed. And so that would be sort of pushing the opposite direction. And there's certainly been some research that shows that when the economy is really good, people tend to get less college, and when it's really bad, they tend to get more. So they're sort of looking for the best use of their time. And when the value of working goes down, the value of schooling goes up. Another factor that could really come into play here is the fact that everybody is sort of stuck at home this spring. And so it's really sort of reduced that connection between counselors and peers and students. And so for those of you who have college educated parents and siblings, it's not going to be as big a deal. You sort of know what's going on. It's going to not have as big an impact. But you can imagine for students who don't have that, then it could have a much larger impact because they don't have the direct access to friends and to counselors to sort of guide them through the college process. And you could end up seeing some of those students not making the transition as a result of not having that kind of guidance. And then there's another long run factor that comes to mind, which is that I'm really worried about the tax situation for states and the federal government over time. I could easily see impacts of having less state funding for universities and federal funding for colleges and universities, and those things having a long run impact on sort of the state of transitioning from high school to college in the long run if there's less aid available. Hopefully I'm not running too far over time. I don't have a clock in front of me. Oh, it looks like I have a couple more minutes, so I'll take advantage of that. So again, another factor, a key transition is this transition between the first and second year of college. Tends to be when people drop out of college, is that freshman to sophomore year transition. And one of the big reasons that people don't drop out from college is because they're surrounded by other college students who are studying. And when instead they live at home or with family, they tend to not be as connected to the education system and more likely to drop out. And so I think that's going to be really interesting because that's essentially what's happened to a lot of college students this spring, is rather than living with their college friends who are also studying, they're now at home with their high school friends or with their families. And so it's created this sort of lack of connection between the college and the student. And I could see that having an impact on whether or not people actually return for their second year. And you could also imagine that some students might feel like they're not getting as high a quality product because a lot of these classes are online right now, and that I imagine a lot of them will be online in the fall, and so they could end up being more likely classes at a community college rather than a four-year college, for example. Again, there's some offsetting factors here. Again, the primary one being that the job prospects are so poor that people might stay in college because it's really their only best option available to them. So While my research doesn't focus on K-12 education, I do have a few thoughts on this, and this is a little bit of a rant. So whenever I hear people bring up education and the fact that kids aren't in school, it's almost always as a result in reference to it being sort of childcare for parents and how important it is for us to have schools so that parents can go to work. I'm sure you've all heard this line of argument or read about it at some point. And I have a little bit of a problem with that because to me, that is certainly important, but by far the most important thing about education is actually the learning that goes on and the human capital that kids get. That second graders and first graders and third graders are learning how to read and how to do math. And that seems to be somewhat lost in this discussion. And it's super important. And almost all economic estimates suggest high returns to a year of education. So my guess is that this cost of having schools close now, or if they close either initially or due to future outbreaks next year, is going to be the highest for lower income households where they're less likely to have parents being able to teach them or prioritizing that. And it could have huge implications for the next 30, 40, 50 years as those kids fall behind and end up not going to college or not getting the jobs that they should because they've lost a year of education. And so to me, I think finding some way to ensure that K-12 children are able to go to school and making that the top priority rather than the last priority, or as a way of helping parents get back to work, needs to be, if not the highest policy priority, one of them, and it really needs to be taken into account. So that's what I have prepared for you today. I really appreciate you inviting me here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you so much. Our first question is from Andy Chen, and he asks, how can the government lessen the current rough transition from college to the labor market? Like, is there anything they could do?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really hard one. There's very little research on this college to labor market transition. And it tends to be very hands-off. You know, it's done at sort of the university level with counseling and things like this. So it's hard to imagine what easy to implement policy there could be that would sort of help people get jobs in a competitive labor market where there are just more people without work. So, you know, you can imagine subsequent to this trying to help people transition, but I'm not aware of any sort of class of policies other than just trying to improve the labor market overall that would sort of be easy to implement and help people with that transition. I mean, you can do things to sort of like alleviate the short run pain. You can do things like not make loans due for a year or something like this so that people are not sort of losing their shelter, for example, or not being able to feed themselves. But that's different than actually making sure that they're not paying the price for this 5 and 10 years from now as a result of being underplaced. So my guess is they do more to focus on sort of like not having loan payments due, loan forgiveness, things like this. That would be sort of their best bet.
Okay, and we have one last question. This kind of talks about what you said about the K through 12 education. Like, is there any way that you think like online learning could ever truly be as effective as in-person learning? Because if we're continuing this for a while, then we have to find a way to like bridge that gap.
Right. I mean, it's such a good question. So I think that especially, I can imagine a motivated high school student getting close to just as much out of online learning as in-person learning or a college student. But it's really hard to imagine that without guidance from a parent who's sitting there side by side with them, a first or a second or a third or a fourth grader getting the same amount of education online as they would in person. Just because you almost need someone there sort of guiding every step. And there's wonderful software out there for learning math and reading, and my son uses some of it, and it's great. But that's different than having all students, especially on the lower end of the income distribution, being able to sort of follow through on that. And my general sense is everyone's been reinventing the wheel this year. So despite the fact that we have, you know, Khan Academies and all this software, a lot of teachers are in public schools are just trying to reinvent education online. And my general sense from talking to a number of parents is that it's not been that successful, that the kids are learning a fraction of what they would in the classroom. And this is among a group of people who are pretty educated themselves. And so I can only imagine that it would be worse the further down the sort of socioeconomic spectrum you go.
Hey, thank you so much, Professor
Hey.
Bulman. Thank you so much for giving your time.
Thanks for having me. And this seemed like a great event, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank you. Okay. All right, folks. This concludes our speaker series for today. Thank you so much to everybody for coming to our presentation. And we hope everyone's had a wonderful time today. Our speakers are fabulous and a lot of new economics ideas were introduced. And just a quick reminder that a recording of this will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards if you want to refer back to the recording. And if you have any lingering questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, you may leave.
Also, you should shortly be getting an email that probably has like a survey telling us what you liked about our speaker series and has all the professors' information from all the speakers today.
Thank you for coming, everybody.